All right, so when we're diagnosing the innominates, we can basically use a little shortcut of just pretending that the innominates are our hands. So when we're doing this, this is my little pelvis. This is our PSIS, this is our ASIS, and this can help us just remember the leg length, which I can go over in a second. But first thing we're going to do when diagnosing is a lateralization test. So for the pelvis, think standing flexion test. Remember, sacrum is seated flexion test. So if the standing flexion test is positive on one side, as in it moves first and or farther, then that is the side that we're thinking about, just so you even ignore the other side. So we're doing our diagnosis. We find a right standing flexion test is positive, and then let's say we find a ASIS that is higher on the left. Ignore that. We are only thinking about the right, so we're not moving our left hand at all. So if it is higher on the left, that means it's more inferior on the right. So think this is lower, and then if the PSIS on the right is higher, then basically what we're doing with our hands here is anteriorly rotating. So we already know that ASIS is inferior and the PSIS is superior. With a right lateralization test positive, then we have an anterior rotation. And with this, you can see that my little leg length thing is lower down on the right. So that means that with an anterior rotation, it seems like our leg is getting longer. And the opposite would be true if it was a posterior. Then that side is going to have a shorter leg. And so then for a posterior rotated innominate, it's just the opposite. ASIS is going to be higher. The PSIS is going to be lower. So yeah, just in test questions, if it will have a lateralization test, and whatever side is negative, just don't even move that hand. Just only pay attention to the hand that was positive. Next thing would be our shears, superior or inferior, also known as upslips and downslips. So an upslip or superior shear is if we have a right standing flexion test and the ASIS is superior and the PSIS is superior, then we got everything is raised up on the right side. So that is our superior shear or upslip. And if it was right side positive, inferior ASIS, inferior PSIS, that's a down shear. Inferior shear downslip, I mean. And then lastly, if we have our in flares and our out flares, what we're doing is you can just measure the distance from the umbilicus to the ASIS. And so if we have a right side that's positive, as in all my other examples, and let's say the distance from the umbilicus to the right ASIS is longer than the left, then we know that it is an out flare, causing that increased distance. Or if it was shorter, so basically what we're doing is just like from the umbilicus to ASIS, and if we compare the lengths, like let's say it was like, it's not going to be this drastic, but if there's a difference in the length, if it's longer on the positive side, out flare, shorter on the positive side, that's an in flare. Okay, so just like the innominates can have a superior or inferior shear, so can the pubic bones. So with an innominate, you're not going to really see like a unleveling of the pubic bones when there is a superior or inferior innominate shear. But with a pubic shear, you're going to be looking at the pubic tubercles and comparing the heights on both sides. And so we're still going to lateralize with the standing flexion test. So if our left side is positive with a standing flexion test, and then we have a superior pubic tubercle on the left, then that's going to be a superior pubic shear. If it was inferior, it'd be an inferior pubic shear. And then another thing that you might see is a pubic compression. And so with pubic compression, you might actually have level pubic rami, but you might have bilateral tenderness over both of those pubic tubercles. Or you might just get a more central tenderness over the pubic symphysis.
Okay, so we're going to do easy explanation of sacrum. So I'm going to actually put you behind me.
Okay.
Okay, so if I tell you there's a right seated flexion test, the first thing you're going to do is put up your right hand in this position. That means that this is now your axis, this is the rest of your sacrum. So this is a left axis. I then tell you that the sacral, if there's a negative spring test, something had to have moved forward, and we always pivot around the axes. So it's going to be turned this way, which would make you give a left on left sacral torsion.
Okay.
Now, if I said the sphinx test or spring test was positive, that means something had to have moved backwards, and then we would have turned this way. You now have a right-facing sacral torsion on a left axis, because the axis points up to the person's left. And that's for the sacral torsions. I pretty much always assume a sacral torsion unless proven otherwise. So you'd know that it was a sacral torsion. This is anterior, this is posterior. Since I know how I moved my hand, this is also posterior, and this is anterior. You just kind of go on how your hand actually looks when you do that motion. And that's what your findings will be for those 4 points. Again, so a forward torsion or a left on left in this case, this would be posterior, this would be posterior, this is anterior, this is anterior. If those don't match up, something flexed. There's only, like, it's split half and half. You either have half unilateral sacral torsion or sacral flexion or a unilateral sacral extension. So kind of go like this. But if they match up anterior, anterior, posterior, posterior, it's going to be a torsion. Now you just have to figure out which one it is. If those don't line up, you figure out again, is it positive on the right? If it's positive on the right, then it's something happened on the right side. If the sphinx test is positive, then something had to have moved backwards. That's always the rule, something moved backwards. So this is now you came back, which means it's a unilateral sacral extension. If the sphinx or spring test is negative, something moved forward, and so now you have unilateral sacral flexion. And the torsion rules hold up on both sides, so if I said it's positive on the left, I throw out my left hand. This is now my axis, which makes it a right axis. I turn my hand towards, if it's, again, we go with, is it positive or negative sphinx? If it's negative sphinx, I turn that way because something had to have moved forward, and we always pivot around the axis. So we now have a right facing, because my hand faces right, on a right axis torsion. Again, the findings for that are going to be anterior, anterior, because that's how my hand looks, and posterior, posterior. If it is, you look at it and go, okay, the sphinx test is negative, that means something, or positive, that means something had to have moved backwards, so I turn my hand like this, and I now have a left-facing sacral torsion on a right axis. And this is really the easy way to do it. So then we have posterior, posterior, anterior, anterior for our sacral findings. And again, the unilaterals are going to be the exact same. If it's positive on the left side is the screwed up side on your seated flexion. If the spring test is negative, it moved forward, we have flexion. If it moved backwards, we have an extension.
Another important aspect of our sacral diagnoses is being able to deduce what the L5 diagnosis is from a sacral torsion diagnosis. And this is a disclaimer. These rules that I'm going to explain here to diagnose L5 from the sacrum only hold true if you're dealing with a sacral torsion of some sort. So that could be your left on left, right on right, your left on right, right on left. But no unilaterals or bilateral sacral extensions or flexions will work for these L5 rules. So the first rule that we need to discuss is how to determine what the rotation of L5 is from a sacral torsion diagnosis. So the rotation of L5 is going to be opposite the rotation of our sacrum during the sacral torsion. So for example, if we have a left on right, which is translated to a left sacral rotation on a right oblique axis, our L5 rotation is going to be right because it needs to be opposite of that left sacral rotation. And then the side bending of L5 can be obtained from the oblique axis that our sacrum is rotating about to produce the torsion. So for our left on right example, that right axis translates to being the direction we are side bent towards for L5. And the reason behind that is that right oblique axis actually tethers down L5 on top of it, holding or inhibiting L5 from freely moving back to its neutral or normal position, and keeps it side bent towards that dysfunctional side for that right oblique axis. So for a left on right, our L5 diagnosis would be flexed, L5 flexed, side bent to the right, rotated to the right. If we use another example, a left on left, or a left sacral rotation on a left oblique axis, our L5 rotation would need to be opposite. So we would have a right rotated L5, and then our oblique axis is left. So that means we are side bent to the left, because that left oblique axis of the sacrum is tethering down and holding down the left side of L5, causing it to side bend to that left side. So for a left on left sacral torsion, our L5 diagnosis is going to be L5 neutral, side bent to the left, rotated to the right. And that's really all it is to it. You may be asked to go from a sacral diagnosis to an L5, from an L5 to a sacral. You may be given little bits and pieces and being asked to kind of trace it back. So get comfortable with these rules, because they really don't change with respect to sacral torsions, and you'll be great to go.